Hi, I'm Alex Mitchell. I stood in the corner of the Riverside Country Club's private dining room, watching my father blow out 75 candles while my stepmother whispered to the waiter about removing my chair from the family table. "We won't be needing that extra seat," she said, glancing at me like I was furniture that didn't match the decor. Then my government phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. Ambassador Li Wei arriving in 10 minutes. Where should we direct him to find the trade secretary? Let me tell you what happens when your family thinks you're nobody and the Chinese government thinks you're indispensable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from Reagan National Airport to Denver had been turbulent, but not nearly as rough as walking into that country club ballroom. I'd flown in specifically for Dad's 75th birthday, rearranging 3 cabinet meetings and postponing a critical conference call with Beijing. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could move mountains in international trade negotiations, but I couldn't move my own family to save me a proper seat at dinner. Patty had outdone herself with the decorations: gold tablecloths, crystal centerpieces, and enough flowers to stock a funeral home. She'd hired a photographer, a string quartet, and even a chef who specialized in what she called elevated comfort food. Every detail screamed expensive taste, funded by the construction company Dad had built from nothing over 4 decades. The same company that Brandon now ran into the ground with his weekend gambling habits, and Jessica managed to avoid discussing whenever quarterly reports came up missing. I smoothed down my navy blazer and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. The same face that had sat across from trade ministers and economic advisors looked back at me, but here in this room I might as well have been invisible. 3 years of living in Georgetown, working 16-hour days in government service, and my family still introduced me as Alex, who does something with paperwork in Washington. They had no idea I'd spent the morning reviewing tariff structures that would affect billions in international commerce, or that my signature had been on agreements that made front-page news in financial newspapers worldwide. The gift table told the whole story. Jessica's elaborate crystal vase dominated the center, catching light from every angle. Brandon's vintage whiskey collection was arranged like a shrine, complete with a handwritten note about finding these rare bottles just for you, Dad. My carefully selected first edition copy of Dad's favorite Western novel sat pushed to the back corner, partially hidden behind someone's oversized flower arrangement. I'd spent weeks tracking down that book through rare book dealers, knowing Dad had mentioned losing his original copy in a house fire 20 years ago. But here it looked like an afterthought, which I supposed it was. "Alex," Dad's voice boomed across the room, and for a moment my chest loosened. He was walking toward me with that familiar grin, the one that used to greet me when I'd come home from college with good grades or stories about landing internships. "I wasn't sure you'd make it, kiddo." The warmth lasted exactly 12 seconds. Patty materialized beside him, her smile as sharp as her perfectly manicured nails. "Oh, we saved you a spot at the overflow table," she said, gesturing toward a small round table near the kitchen doors. "The family table filled up faster than we expected." Her eyes swept over my government-issued BlackBerry, which had been buzzing intermittently since I arrived. "Hopefully work won't be calling during dinner. This is family time." Family time. Right. I glanced at the main table, where place cards marked spots for Dad, Patty, Jessica and her husband Mike, Brandon and his latest girlfriend, and even Jessica's twin boys who were currently running circles around the room screaming about Pokemon cards. The overflow table held exactly one place setting and a view of the service station. "That's fine," I said, because what else could I say? That I'd negotiated trade agreements with more dignity than this, that foreign diplomats treated me with more respect than my own stepmother, that I'd rather be in the middle of a congressional hearing than sitting at the kids' table at age 32. Brandon appeared at my shoulder, reeking of whiskey and cologne. "Look who showed up. How's the government job, Alex?" Still pushing papers around, he clapped me on the back hard enough to make me step forward. Dad was just telling everyone about how you work for some department in DC. Sounds exciting. His tone suggested it sounded about as exciting as watching paint dry. Department of Commerce, I corrected quietly. Commerce, right. Brandon snapped his fingers like he'd just solved a puzzle. Like business stuff. That's cool, I guess. Not as hands-on as what I do with the construction crews, but hey, somebody's got to do the desk jobs, right? If only he knew that my desk job involved preventing trade wars that could collapse entire industries, that the business stuff I handled affected commodity prices, manufacturing quotas, and employment rates across dozens of states, that while he was running Dad's company into debt with his poor decision-making, I was literally helping shape American economic policy at the international level. My phone buzzed again, a text from Helen Crawford, my director. Ambassador Li's flight landed early, ETA to your location in 15 minutes. Please confirm your availability for the preliminary discussion. I excused myself to the bathroom to respond. Helen knew I was at a family event, but she also knew that when the Chinese ambassador requests a face-to-face meeting, you don't reschedule, especially not when we were 48 hours away from announcing a trade agreement that had taken 8 months to negotiate. Available as needed, I texted back. Private dining room at Riverside Country Club, Denver. Will coordinate discreet meeting space. Her response was immediate. Ambassador specifically asked for you by name. This is significant. Be ready. Be ready. I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, tie straight, hair combed, looking every inch the professional I'd become despite my family's inability to see it. 3 years ago, I'd been a nobody fresh out of Georgetown's graduate program in international economics. Today I was the point person on one of the most important trade relationships in modern American history. Tomorrow, assuming tonight's preliminary meeting went well, my name would be in newspapers across the globe, but right now, I was just Alex who got seated at the overflow table. When I returned to the dining room, dinner service was beginning. Patty had positioned herself at the head of the family table like a conductor preparing for a symphony, directing servers and making sure everyone's wine glasses stayed filled. The photographer she'd hired was making the rounds, capturing candid moments of family togetherness that somehow never seemed to include me in the frame. From my solitary table, I watched Jessica hold court with stories about her marketing firm's latest client, some tech startup that was revolutionizing social media engagement. Brandon was deep in conversation with Dad about expanding the construction business into commercial real estate, gesturing with his fork and spilling sauce on the white tablecloth. Patty kept one eye on the servers and the other on her phone, probably posting real-time updates to social media about what a wonderful daughter-in-law she was for organizing such an elegant celebration. The irony was suffocating. Here I was, invisible at my own father's birthday party, while across town my absence from a government function would have prompted phone calls and rescheduled meetings. In Washington, my opinions carried weight.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
In rooms where decisions affected millions of people. In Denver, I couldn't even get a proper chair at the family table. My BlackBerry lit up with another message, this one from Ambassador Li Wei himself. Looking forward to our discussion, Deputy Secretary Mitchell. The preliminary framework you proposed shows exceptional insight into market dynamics. We anticipate a productive dialogue, Deputy Secretary Mitchell. The title still gave me chills, even after 6 months in the position. I'd been the youngest person ever appointed to the role, and certainly the first to come from a working-class family in Colorado. Most deputy trade secretaries were Harvard or Yale graduates, whose fathers had been ambassadors or cabinet members. I'd earned my position through sheer competence and an uncanny ability to understand how international economics affected real people in real communities. Alex, honey, you're not eating. Patty's voice carried across the room, drawing attention to my barely touched plate. Is everything okay over there? You seem distracted. Distracted? I was preparing for a meeting that could affect the economic relationship between the world's two largest economies, and she thought I seemed distracted because I wasn't enthusiastic about herb-crusted salmon. Just thinking about work, I said, which was technically true. Brandon laughed loudly. Work on a Saturday night? Man, they really do own you in that government job, don't they? At least when I'm done for the day, I'm done. None of this checking emails during family dinner nonsense. Some responsibilities don't follow business hours, I replied more sharply than I intended. Responsibilities, Jessica repeated, making air quotes. Alex, you're not performing brain surgery, it's just paperwork. Can't it wait until Monday? Just paperwork. I'd spent the week reviewing trade data that would determine whether American farmers could access Chinese markets worth $12 billion annually. I'd been on conference calls with agricultural representatives from 17 states, all of whom were counting on the agreements I'd helped structure. My paperwork would directly impact commodity prices, shipping schedules, and employment rates in industries from manufacturing to agriculture to technology. But to them, I was just their little sibling who'd moved away and gotten too big for their britches. The photographer approached my table, camera raised, and I automatically straightened up and smiled. She paused, looked back at the family table, then lowered her camera. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you with the Mitchell family? He's my son, Dad called out from across the room. The photographer looked confused. Oh well, we're focusing on the immediate family shots tonight. For the album, you understand. She gestured vaguely toward the main table. The package includes candid shots of the honoree with his closest family members. His closest family members. I wasn't even worth a candid shot at my own father's birthday celebration. Of course, I said, because making a scene wouldn't accomplish anything except confirming their opinion that I'd become difficult since moving to DC. As the photographer moved away, I caught Dad looking at me with something that might have been sympathy, or maybe just indigestion from the rich appetizers. For a moment, I thought he might say something, might acknowledge that this arrangement was awkward at best, and cruel at worst. Instead, he turned back to Brandon's animated description of a construction project that was apparently revolutionizing concrete pouring techniques in suburban Denver. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen. Ambassador's motorcade is approaching your location, black sedans with diplomatic plates. He'll ask for you by official title. Hope you're ready to make history tonight. Ready to make history. The words sent electricity through my nervous system. In 2 minutes, maybe 3, Ambassador Li Wei would walk into this country club dining room and ask for Deputy Trade Secretary Mitchell, and my carefully constructed invisible existence would explode like a firecracker in a library. I looked around the room one more time. Patty was posing for photos with Dad, her arms around his shoulders, every inch the devoted wife. Jessica was showing off pictures of her boys' latest soccer tournament victories. Brandon was explaining his 5-year plan for expanding Mitchell construction into 3 neighboring states, all of them completely absorbed in their own worlds, none of them paying the slightest attention to me. In 60 seconds, that was all going to change. My phone rang. Helen Crawford's number. Alex, the ambassador's security detail is requesting confirmation of your location within the building. Can you provide specific details? Private dining room, 2nd floor east wing. I said quietly. The Riverside ballroom. They'll need to go through the main lobby and take the elevator. Perfect. Alex, I want you to know how proud the entire department is of your work on this negotiation. What you've accomplished at your age, with your background, it's unprecedented. Tonight's preliminary meeting could be the culmination of everything we've worked toward. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. Unprecedented. The culmination of everything we've worked toward. In my family's eyes, I was the kid who couldn't even get a seat at the grown-up table. In the U.S. Department of Commerce, I was making history. Thank you, Director Crawford. I won't let you down. You never do, Alex. You never do. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my jacket pocket. From across the room, I could hear the string quartet transitioning into Happy Birthday, and I watched my family gather around Dad's chair for the ceremonial cake cutting. Patty had ordered a massive 3-tier creation decorated with edible gold leaf and sugar flowers. Even from my distant table, I could see the inscription, "Happy 75th birthday to our family patriarch." Our family patriarch. Not mine, apparently. Theirs. The dining room doors opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He was followed by another man, then another. Security detail, subtle but unmistakable. They positioned themselves at strategic points around the room, while maintaining the pretense of casual observation. Then Ambassador Li Wei entered the room. He was shorter than I'd expected from our video conferences, but his presence filled the space immediately. Distinguished silver hair, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, an expression of polite curiosity as he surveyed the birthday celebration. His eyes moved methodically around the room, taking in the decorations, the photographer, the string quartet, the family gathered around the birthday cake. His gaze found me at the overflow table, and he smiled. "Excuse me," he said to the room in general, his accent crisp and educated. "I apologize for the interruption of your celebration. I am Ambassador Li Wei from the Chinese Embassy. I am looking for Deputy Trade Secretary Mitchell." The string quartet stopped playing. The room went absolutely silent. Every head turned toward the ambassador, then followed his gaze directly to me. Jessica's mouth fell open. Brandon's fork clattered onto his plate. Patty's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the shock spreading across her face like spilled wine on white fabric. Dad blinked rapidly like he was trying to solve a math problem that suddenly had too many variables. I stood up slowly, straightening my jacket and walking toward the ambassador with what I hoped looked like professional composure rather than the profound satisfaction that was currently flooding my nervous system. "Ambassador Li Wei," I said, extending my hand. "Thank you for making the trip. I apologize for the informal setting." "Not at all, Deputy Secretary," he replied, shaking my hand firmly. "Family celebrations are important. I hope I have not disrupted your father's birthday party." Deputy Secretary. The title echoed through the dead silent dining room like a gunshot. I turned toward my family, all of whom were staring at me like I'd just sprouted wings, and started speaking Mandarin. "Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silence, "I'd like you to meet Ambassador Li Wei from the People's Republic of China." "Ambassador, this is my father, Robert Mitchell." Dad stood up shakily, his napkin falling to the floor. It's an honor, Ambassador." "The honor is mine, Mr. Mitchell," Li Wei said graciously. "You should be very proud of your son. His work on the agricultural trade framework has been exceptional. Deputy Secretary Mitchell has shown remarkable insight into the complexities of international commerce." "Deputy Secretary," Dad repeated faintly. "Oh yes," the ambassador continued, apparently oblivious to the family drama unfolding around him. "Deputy Mitchell is one of the youngest officials ever to hold such a position. His negotiation skills are quite legendary within diplomatic circles. The preliminary agreements he has structured will benefit both our nations significantly." Brandon made a choking sound that might have been an attempt at speech. Jessica was staring at me like she'd never seen me before in her life. Patty had gone completely pale, except for 2 bright spots of red on her cheeks that suggested either embarrassment or rage, possibly both. "I'm sorry," I said to the ambassador, "but would you mind if we stepped into the hallway for our discussion? I don't want to interrupt the celebration any further." "Of course, Deputy Secretary. Lead the way." As we moved toward the door, I heard Brandon whisper to Jessica, "Did he just call Alex Deputy Secretary?" "Shut up," Jessica hissed back. The last thing I saw before the dining room doors closed was Dad still standing beside his birthday cake, staring after me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disappointment. Not dismissal. Not the polite disinterest that had characterized our interactions for the past 3 years. Respect. For the first time in my adult life, my father was looking at me with genuine respect. The hallway outside the Riverside ballroom felt like stepping into a different universe. The muffled sounds of shocked conversation leaked through the heavy oak doors behind us, but out here, with the ambassador and his security detail, I was back in my element. This was the world I understood, where protocols mattered and competence was currency. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, Ambassador Li said as we walked toward a smaller conference room the club manager had quickly made available. Director Crawford informed me this was a family gathering, but the urgency of tomorrow's announcement required immediate consultation. No apology necessary, Ambassador. Family dynamics can be complicated, but international trade waits for no one. I held the conference room door open for him, noting how his security detail positioned themselves discreetly in the hallway. These were professionals who understood the delicate balance between protection and diplomacy. The room was intimate, designed for business meetings rather than celebrations. A polished mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, windows overlooking the Denver skyline, and blessed silence after the chaos of the birthday party. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time all evening. Before we begin our discussion, Ambassador Li said, settling into his chair, I must express my curiosity about your family's reaction. They seemed surprised by your position. I loosened my tie slightly, choosing my words carefully. International trade policy isn't exactly dinner conversation in most American households, Ambassador. My family operates a regional construction business. They understand building foundations and laying concrete, not navigating tariff structures and commodity agreements. Ah, he nodded thoughtfully. But surely they must be proud of your accomplishments. Deputy Trade Secretary at your age is remarkable, especially given your background in agricultural economics from Georgetown. Your dissertation on sustainable trade relationships was quite influential in academic circles. My dissertation? I'd spent 18 months researching how trade policies affected rural farming communities, interviewing farmers across the Midwest, analyzing data that most economists ignored because it was too granular, too human. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd built my entire career on understanding how international agreements affected working families, while my own working family had no idea what I did for a living. They know I work in government, I said diplomatically. The specifics of international commerce can seem abstract when your daily concerns involve payroll and construction permits. Ambassador Li smiled knowingly. In China, we say that the mountain does not need to prove its height to the valley. Your work speaks for itself, Deputy Secretary. Now, shall we discuss the preliminary framework? He opened his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with documents. As he spread them across the table, I recognized my own work reflected back at me. Months of negotiations, countless revisions, complex formulas that balanced American agricultural interests with Chinese manufacturing needs. Each page represented dozens of phone calls, strategy sessions, and late nights in my Georgetown apartment reviewing trade data until my eyes burned. The soybean quota adjustments you proposed, Ambassador Li said, pointing to a highlighted section, show exceptional understanding of both market dynamics and political realities. Our agricultural ministry was impressed by your insight into regional growing patterns. I leaned forward, scanning the documents. These were the real achievements of my career, the tangible proof that all those years of studying economics and learning Mandarin and building relationships with agricultural representatives had meaning. The key was recognizing that quota flexibility benefits both nations. American farmers get market access predictability, and Chinese manufacturers get supply chain reliability. Precisely. And your solution to the technology transfer concerns was equally elegant. Rather than viewing intellectual property as a zero-sum competition, you structured mutual benefit protocols. We spent the next hour deep in the details. Export volumes, shipping schedules, currency fluctuation buffers, enforcement mechanisms. This was the language I spoke fluently, the arena where my expertise mattered. Ambassador Li asked probing questions about implementation timelines and congressional approval processes, and I had answers backed by months of preparation and consultation with industry experts. There is one concern, Ambassador Li said as we neared the end of our review. The announcement tomorrow will generate significant media attention. Are you prepared for the scrutiny that comes with success at this level? I paused, thinking about the dining room full of family members who'd just learned that their overlooked relative was apparently newsworthy enough to warrant personal visits from foreign ambassadors. I've spent 3 years building my credibility through competence rather than publicity, Ambassador. I believe the work should speak louder than the headlines. Admirable philosophy. However, political reality suggests you may need to become more comfortable with public recognition. Success in international trade requires visibility and credibility with multiple stakeholders. He gathered his documents methodically. Your family, for instance, their support could be valuable as your career progresses. Their support. I thought about Brandon's dismissive comments about desk jobs, Jessica's air quotes around the word responsibilities, Patty's seating arrangements that relegated me to the overflow table. Support seemed like an optimistic assessment of their likely reaction to learning. I'd been living a double life for 3 years. Family relationships can be complex, I said carefully. Professional achievements don't always translate into personal understanding. Perhaps, Ambassador Li said, standing and extending his hand. But tonight's surprise may create new opportunities for both understanding and support. Your father seemed quite stunned by the revelation. Stunned was certainly one way to describe Dad's expression. I'd seen that same look on his face the day I told him I was turning down a job offer from a Denver engineering firm to pursue graduate school in Washington. Confusion mixed with something that might have been disappointment, as though I was making choices that didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed about my life. Thank you for accommodating the unusual circumstances of tonight's meeting, I said, shaking his hand. I'll have final revisions to the implementation timeline on your desk by Monday morning. Excellent. Deputy Secretary, tomorrow's announcement will make headlines and financial papers across both our nations. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. He paused at the door. And perhaps your family will finally understand what their son has been building in Washington. After the ambassador's motorcade disappeared into Denver traffic, I found myself standing alone in the country club lobby, trying to process what had just happened. For 3 years I'd lived in 2 separate worlds. In Washington, I was Deputy Trade Secretary Alex Mitchell, the youngest person ever to hold the position, the farm kid from Colorado who'd somehow mastered the complexities of international commerce. In Denver, I was just Alex, the family member who'd moved away and lost touch with reality. Tonight, those worlds had collided in the most public way possible. I could hear voices from the ballroom, more animated now than when I'd left. The birthday celebration was apparently continuing, but the tone had shifted from polite family gathering to something that sounded more like a strategy session. I caught fragments through the door. Brandon's voice rising above the others. How were we supposed to know? Jessica responding with something about government secrecy. Patty's sharp tones cutting through both of them. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen Crawford. Ambassador Li just called to confirm tomorrow's announcement. Says preliminary meeting went perfectly. Congratulations, Alex. You've earned this moment. Earned this moment. I looked at my reflection in the lobby's ornate mirror, straightening my tie and running a hand through my hair. The same face that had sat across from trade ministers and economic advisors looked back at me, but something had shifted. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like I was living a double life. I felt like I was finally living as myself. The ballroom doors opened, and Dad stepped into the lobby. He'd removed his birthday crown, a ridiculous gold paper thing that Patty had insisted he wear for photos, and his expression was serious. We stood there for a moment, 2 men who'd spent decades talking past each other, suddenly forced to confront the reality of who we'd become. Alex, he said finally. We need to talk. I followed him to a quiet seating area near the club's main windows. The leather chairs were deep and comfortable, designed for conversations that mattered. Dad settled heavily into his chair, and I could see the weight of 75 years in the way his shoulders sagged. Deputy Trade Secretary, he said, testing the words like they were written in a foreign language. How long? 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, I replied without hesitation. Since my promotion from senior trade analyst, he nodded slowly, processing. And before that, 2 years as senior analyst, 18 months as junior analyst, 1 year as research assistant while I finished my graduate program. I realized I was reciting my resume like a job interview, but I didn't know how else to explain the trajectory that had taken me from his construction company, disappointment to international trade policy. Jesus, Alex. Dad rubbed his temples. 8 years. You've been doing this for 8 years, and we thought you were filing papers somewhere. I never lied to you, I said carefully. When you asked about my job, I said I worked for the Department of Commerce. When you asked what I did, I said I handled international trade issues. The information was always available. Dad, you just never seemed interested in the details. He winced. We thought trade issues meant paperwork, import forms, export permits, that kind of thing. In fairness, that's part of it, but the position involves policy development, negotiation strategy, economic analysis, congressional testimony, international diplomacy. I paused. The agricultural trade framework we're announcing tomorrow will affect farming communities in 17 states. The technology transfer protocols could impact manufacturing employment across the Midwest. Dad stared out the window at the Denver skyline, lights twinkling in the distance. The Chinese ambassador knew your name. We've been negotiating for 8 months. This isn't my first interaction with Chinese trade officials. He said your negotiation skills were legendary. I felt heat rise in my cheeks despite myself. Ambassador Led has been very complimentary about our collaborative approach to complex trade relationships. Legendary, Alex. He said legendary. Dad turned back to me. Do you understand what that means? In my world, legendary means something. It means people respect your work. They seek your opinion. They trust your judgment. I did understand, probably better than he realized. In Washington, my opinion carried weight in rooms where decisions affected millions of people. Congressional representatives asked for my analysis before voting on trade legislation. Industry leaders called me directly when they needed clarity on regulatory changes. Foreign diplomats requested meetings because they valued my expertise. I've been fortunate to work with exceptional colleagues, I said diplomatically. Fortunate? Dad shook his head. Alex, you don't get to be the youngest deputy trade secretary in American history through good fortune. You don't have Chinese ambassadors showing up at birthday parties because you filed paperwork efficiently. The truth was more complicated than good fortune, but also simpler than the narrative Dad was constructing. I'd worked 16-hour days for 8 years, learning languages and building relationships and mastering details that most people found mind-numbingly boring. I'd turned down higher-paying jobs in private industry because I believed government service mattered. I'd sacrificed social relationships and family connections because international trade policy demanded everything I had to give. Why didn't you tell us? Dad asked quietly. The question hung between us like a challenge. Why hadn't I told them? Why had I let them believe I was just another government employee pushing papers around a Washington office? Why had I endured years of dismissive comments and casual mockery rather than simply explaining what I actually did for a living? Would you have believed me? I asked finally. Dad started to respond, then stopped. We both knew the answer. 3 years ago, when I'd first been promoted to Deputy Trade Secretary, I'd called home excited to share the news. Dad had congratulated me politely, then spent 10 minutes explaining why Brandon's latest construction contract was more impressive because it involved real work with real results that people could see and touch. The message had been clear. Government jobs were fine for people who couldn't handle real responsibility, but building things was what mattered. We didn't understand, Dad said after a long pause. No, I agreed. You didn't, but we should have tried. That admission hung in the air between us, heavier than any accusation. Dad was acknowledging not just ignorance, but willful disinterest. For 8 years, his son had been building a career in international policy, and he'd never bothered to learn what that meant. Brandon runs the construction company into debt with his gambling habits. I said quietly. Jessica's marketing firm has been operating at a loss for 2 years, but she won't admit it. Patty spends more on decorating this birthday party than most families spend on rent. But somehow I'm the family disappointment, because I chose public service over profit. Dad's jaw tightened. You're not a disappointment, Alex. I sat at the overflow table tonight, Dad, at your 75th birthday celebration. Your son who works in international trade policy got seated by the kitchen doors because there wasn't room at the family table. That was Patty's decision, not mine. You didn't intervene. He couldn't argue with that because it was true. Dad had watched Patty relegate me to social Siberia, and he'd said nothing. Just like he'd said nothing when Brandon made jokes about my desk job, or when Jessica dismissed my work as just paperwork, or when family conversations systematically excluded any mention of my life in Washington. I'm sorry, Dad said finally. The words sounded rusty, like he didn't use them often enough to wear them smooth. We've been small, narrow. We thought we understood the world, but tonight showed us how much we don't know. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to accept his apology and move forward, to build something new from this moment of recognition. Another part of me remembered 8 years of feeling invisible in my own family, of driving to Denver for visits that left me questioning my own worth. The announcement tomorrow, Dad said. It's big. Front page of the Financial Times, I said. Probably the Wall Street Journal. The agricultural provisions alone will affect commodity prices across multiple industries. Will you be on television? The question surprised me with its earnestness. Probably. The State Department typically holds press conferences for major trade announcements. Secretary Williams will make the primary statement, but deputy secretaries usually field questions from economic reporters. Dad nodded like he was filing away information for future reference. We'll watch. The whole family. You don't have to. Yes, he said firmly. We do. We've missed too much already. My phone buzzed with another message from Helen Crawford. Preliminary media advisory going out in 2 hours. Hope you're ready for the spotlight, Alex. This is your moment to shine, my moment to shine. I looked at Dad, really looked at him, seeing not the patriarch who'd dismissed my career choices, but a 75-year-old man trying to reconcile his assumptions with an uncomfortable new reality. For the first time in years, he was seeing me as I actually was rather than who he'd expected me to become. I should probably head back to the hotel, I said. Early flight tomorrow, and I need to review my talking points before the press conference. Of course. Dad stood slowly, then hesitated. Alex, when this is all over, when the announcement is made, and the reporters have moved on to other stories, would you consider coming home for a longer visit? Not for a birthday or holiday, just to spend time. Help us understand what your life is really like. The offer surprised me. For 8 years, visits home had been obligatory, dutiful exercises in family maintenance. Dad was proposing something different, genuine curiosity about my world. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. We walked back toward the ballroom together, father and son navigating new territory. The birthday celebration was winding down, guests gathering coats and purses, the string quartet packing up their instruments. But I could feel eyes following me as we entered the room, family members and family friends trying to reconcile their assumptions about quiet Alex with the reality of a deputy trade secretary important enough to warrant personal visits from foreign ambassadors. Brandon approached cautiously, his earlier swagger replaced by something that looked like curiosity mixed with embarrassment. Alex, I owe you an apology. I had no idea. You couldn't have known, I said diplomatically. No, but I should have asked, should have shown more interest. He paused, searching for words. Deputy Trade Secretary, that's incredible, man, like, really incredible. Jessica appeared at his shoulder, her expression unreadable. The Chinese ambassador seemed to know you quite well. We've worked together on several negotiations, I said carefully, and tomorrow's announcement, it's important. I considered how to explain 8 months of complex negotiations in terms she might understand. The agricultural provisions alone will affect farm communities across 17 states. The technology transfer protocols could impact manufacturing employment throughout the Midwest. Her eyes widened. You're talking about real policy, like actual government policy that affects people's lives. That's what international trade does, I said simply. Every agreement, every tariff adjustment, every quota modification affects real communities and real families. Patty had been hovering at the edge of our conversation, and now she stepped forward with a smile that seemed more genuine than anything I'd seen from her all evening. Alex, I feel terrible about the seating arrangements. If I'd known about your position, about your accomplishments, the seating arrangements reflected your understanding of my importance to the family, I said quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. The words hung in the air, not accusatory but factual. Patty's face flushed, and she looked away. That changes now, Dad said firmly. Everything changes now. I wanted to believe him, wanted to think that one evening's revelation could undo years of dismissal and neglect. But I also knew that respect earned through shock and surprise was different from respect earned through understanding and appreciation. Tomorrow's headlines might change how they viewed my career, but they wouldn't necessarily change how they viewed me. Still, as I gathered my coat and prepared to leave, I felt something shift in the family dynamic. The conversations were different now, more tentative but also more genuinely curious. Brandon asked about my work with agricultural representatives. Jessica wanted to know how international agreements got negotiated. Even Patty seemed genuinely interested in learning about my life in Washington. We'll be watching tomorrow, Dad said as I prepared to leave. All of us. I appreciate that, Alex, he said, gripping my shoulder. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. Whatever you've built in Washington, whatever you've accomplished, I'm proud of you. The words hit harder than I expected. For 8 years, I'd been building a career that mattered, negotiating agreements that affected millions of people, earning recognition from colleagues and foreign diplomats and congressional representatives. But I'd never heard those words from the man whose opinion had shaped my understanding of success and failure. Thank you, Dad. That means everything. I walked out of the Riverside Country Club into the crisp Denver evening, my phone already buzzing with messages from Washington colleagues preparing for tomorrow's announcement. In 12 hours, I'd be standing in front of cameras and reporters, explaining trade policies that would make front-page news across multiple countries. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, I felt like I was finally bringing my two worlds together. The family that had dismissed me was beginning to understand what I'd actually accomplished. The career I'd built in isolation was finally being recognized by the people whose opinions mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new responsibilities, but tonight, I was exactly where I belonged. Alex Mitchell, Deputy Trade Secretary, son of Robert Mitchell, member of a family that was finally beginning to see me for who I'd become, rather than who they'd expected me to be. The alarm in my hotel room buzzed at 5:30 Monday morning, but I'd been awake for over an hour, reviewing notes and rehearsing responses to potential questions from reporters. The trade announcement would be broadcast live from the State Department at 11 o'clock Eastern Time, which meant 9 o'clock Mountain Time in Denver. I wondered if my family would actually tune in, or if last night's shock would fade into comfortable dismissal once the immediacy wore off. My phone had been buzzing since 4 a.m., with messages from colleagues, reporters requesting preliminary comments, and agricultural representatives from affected states wanting confirmation of quota details. The weight of 8 months of negotiation was about to become public record, and every stakeholder who'd been waiting for this moment wanted immediate reassurance that their interests had been protected. Helen Crawford called as I was knotting my tie. "Alex, the secretary wants you front and center for today's announcement. You'll be standing with the primary delegation when she makes the opening statement, and you'll field questions about agricultural provisions and implementation timelines, front and center." For 8 years, I'd been content working behind the scenes, crafting policy without seeking spotlight. But Helen was right, that successful trade policy required public credibility, and today marked my transition from anonymous negotiator to public face of American trade relations. "Any word from the Hill about congressional reaction?" I asked, reviewing my notes one final time. "Senator Williams from Iowa is already calling it a victory for Midwest farmers. Representative Chen from California wants specifics about technology transfer protections. Overall response looks positive, but you know how quickly that can change once people start analyzing details." I knew exactly how quickly political support could evaporate. Trade policy existed in a complex web of competing interests, and every agreement that benefited one industry potentially disadvantaged another. The framework we'd negotiated represented months of balancing agricultural access against manufacturing concerns, technology sharing against intellectual property protection, economic growth against national security considerations. "I'll be ready," I said, because being ready was what deputy trade secretaries did, regardless of personal circumstances or family drama. The flight from Denver to Washington took 3 hours, which gave me time to review media talking points and prepare for questions I couldn't anticipate. But my mind kept drifting back to Dad's expression when Ambassador Li Wei had used the word legendary to describe my negotiation skills. 8 years of building expertise, and it had taken a foreign diplomat's praise to make my own father see me as something other than a disappointment. By the time I reached my Georgetown apartment, reporters were already gathering outside the State Department building. The advance media advisory had generated more interest than usual, partly because agricultural trade agreements affected constituencies across multiple states, and partly because the timing coincided with ongoing concerns about American competitiveness in international markets. I had 45 minutes to shower, change into my best suit, and review final notes before departing for the announcement. My apartment felt strange, after the emotional intensity of the previous evening, like returning to a stage set after the real drama had played out elsewhere. The same books on international economics, the same awards on my desk, the same photographs from diplomatic functions where I'd gradually built relationships that culminated in last night's visit from Ambassador Li Wei. My landline rang, an unusual occurrence, since most communication happened through secure government channels. The caller ID showed my father's number. "Alex, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The question struck me as absurd, given that he was calling 2 hours before a press conference that would make international headlines, but I recognized the olive branch in his tone, the attempt to engage with my world, rather than dismiss it. "Just preparing for the announcement, Dad. What's on your mind?" I wanted to apologize for last night, not just the seating arrangements, but everything. 8 years of not understanding, not asking the right questions, not showing interest in what you'd accomplished. His voice was careful, like he was reading from notes he'd prepared. "We watched the morning news, and they're already talking about today's trade announcement. They mentioned your name, Alex, on national television." I felt an unexpected tightness in my chest. For 8 years, my name had appeared in policy briefings and economic reports, but it had never occurred to me that my family might see those references. In their world, government work was invisible unless it generated headlines or affected their daily lives directly. "The announcement will affect agricultural communities across 17 states, I said, falling back on professional talking points, because personal conversations still felt complicated. "We've been working on this framework for 8 months, the reporter said, It could be worth billions in new markets for American farmers. Dad's voice carried a note of wonder. Billions, Alex. You negotiated something worth billions of dollars. The scale was accurate but incomplete. Trade agreements weren't just about dollar amounts, they were about employment stability, supply chain reliability, technology advancement, diplomatic relationships. But I understood why Dad focused on the financial impact, because that was language he could understand and measure. It's complex, I said. The financial projections represent potential market access over multiple years, contingent on implementation success, and yes, if executed properly, the agricultural provisions alone could generate significant economic activity, and you did this. You negotiated this. I was part of a team, I corrected automatically. International trade policy requires coordination across multiple departments and agencies: the State Department, Commerce Department, Agriculture Department, Treasury, representatives from affected industries. But you were the lead negotiator. I paused, considering how to explain the nuances of diplomatic hierarchy and collaborative policy development. I was the primary point of contact for agricultural provisions and implementation protocols. Ambassador Li Wei and I worked closely on balancing American farming interests with Chinese manufacturing needs. "Geez," Dad whispered, "my son is on the news, talking about billion-dollar trade deals with China." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but it also highlighted how fundamental our disconnect had been. For 8 years, I'd been building exactly this kind of career, negotiating exactly these kinds of agreements, working with exactly these kinds of international partners. The only difference was that today's announcement would generate headlines, rather than remain buried in policy documents and economic reports. "I need to head to the State Department," I said gently. "The press conference starts in 90 minutes. "Of course, Alex. We'll all be watching." Brandon called in sick to work, just to see the announcement. Jessica rearranged her entire meeting schedule. Patty bought a new television specifically so we could watch in high definition. The image of my family gathered around Patty's new television, watching me field questions from international reporters, felt surreal. For years, family gatherings had involved polite inquiries about my government job, followed by detailed discussions of construction projects and marketing campaigns. Today, they'd be watching their overlooked relative represent American interests in front of cameras broadcasting to millions of viewers. "I appreciate the support," I said, and meant it despite the complicated emotions surrounding their sudden interest. "Make us proud, son." The words hit me unexpectedly hard. Make us proud. As though my 8 years of government service, my graduate degree from Georgetown, my promotion to Deputy Trade Secretary, my successful negotiation of complex international agreements hadn't already been worthy of pride. As though pride was contingent on public recognition rather than personal accomplishment. But I understood what Dad meant, even if he couldn't articulate it clearly. He was asking me to bridge the gap between their world and mine, to help them understand not just what I did for a living, but why it mattered. "I'll do my best," I said. The State Department briefing room was more crowded than usual when I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled announcement. Economic reporters from major newspapers, correspondents from financial networks, representatives from agricultural publications, even a few international journalists covering American trade policy. The energy in the room was focused and expectant, the kind of atmosphere that accompanied genuinely significant policy announcements. Secretary Williams was reviewing final notes when I found her in the preparation room behind the podium. She looked up as I entered, her expression mixing professional focus with personal warmth. "Alex, ready for your moment in the spotlight, ready as anyone can be for impromptu public diplomacy," I replied, checking my tie in the mirror one final time. "This announcement represents the best of American trade policy," she said, gathering her papers. "Complex negotiation, balanced outcomes, genuine mutual benefit. You should be proud of what you've accomplished." "Proud," The word kept surfacing in conversations, as though pride was the natural response to professional competency, but I'd been doing this work for 8 years without needing external validation, driven by genuine belief that international trade policy could improve people's lives, rather than by desire for recognition or praise. It's been a collaborative effort, I said diplomatically. Don't be modest, Alex. Leadership means accepting credit when it's deserved, especially in public forums. Today's announcement will generate significant media attention, and you need to be comfortable representing not just the policy, but your own expertise. She was right, of course. Deputy trade secretaries weren't just policy analysts, they were public faces of American economic diplomacy. Today marked my transition from behind-the-scenes negotiator to visible government spokesperson, a role that required confidence and authority rather than self-deprecating deflection. Understood, Madam Secretary. Good. Now let's go make history. The briefing room felt different from the podium side. Cameras focused like spotlights, reporters poised with notebooks and digital recorders. I took my position behind Secretary Williams, flanked by representatives from Agriculture and Treasury, conscious that my family was probably gathered around Patty's new television watching their first glimpse of my professional world. Good morning, Secretary Williams began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's audio system. Today, the United States announces a comprehensive trade framework with the People's Republic of China that will benefit American workers, farmers, and manufacturers, while strengthening diplomatic relationships between our nations. The formal language of diplomatic announcements felt familiar after 8 years of policy development, but the weight of public scrutiny added intensity I hadn't anticipated. Every word would be analyzed, quoted, debated by stakeholders across multiple industries and political constituencies. The agricultural provisions of this agreement, negotiated primarily by Deputy Trade Secretary Alex Mitchell, will provide American farmers with unprecedented access to Chinese markets while ensuring fair competition and sustainable trade relationships. My name echoed through the briefing room, carried by microphones to broadcast networks and streaming services. Somewhere in Denver, my family was hearing my professional identity acknowledged on national television for the first time in my career. Secretary Williams continued with overview details, but I knew the real test would come during the question and answer session, when reporters demanded specifics about implementation timelines, enforcement mechanisms, potential challenges. This was where months of preparation would either validate my expertise or expose gaps in my understanding. I'll now turn to Deputy Secretary Mitchell for details about agricultural provisions and implementation protocols. I stepped forward to the podium, looking out at a room full of reporters whose questions could shape public understanding of policies that would affect millions of people. In the back of my mind, I thought about Dad watching from Denver, finally seeing the professional competence he'd never bothered to investigate. Thank you, Secretary Williams. The agricultural framework we're announcing today represents 8 months of intensive negotiation focused on creating sustainable market access for American farmers while respecting the economic sovereignty of our Chinese partners. My voice carried steadily through the room, 8 years of policy briefings and congressional testimony, providing foundation for this moment of public explanation. The soybean quota adjustments alone will provide American farmers with market access worth approximately $4.7 billion annually, with built-in flexibility mechanisms to accommodate seasonal variations and market fluctuations. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal raised her hand. Deputy Secretary Mitchell, can you explain how these quota adjustments will affect domestic pricing and supply chain logistics? This was exactly the kind of detailed question that separated competent policy analysts from truly expert negotiators. The answer required understanding not just international trade mechanics, but domestic agricultural economics, transportation infrastructure, and market psychology. The quota framework includes graduated implementation over 18 months, allowing domestic supply chains to adjust capacity while maintaining price stability. I replied, drawing on months of consultation with agricultural representatives and transportation analysts, we've coordinated with the Department of Transportation and private logistics companies to ensure infrastructure readiness, and we've built buffer mechanisms into the quotas to prevent sudden market disruptions. Another reporter followed up, what about enforcement? How do we ensure compliance with technology transfer provisions while maintaining productive diplomatic relationships? The enforcement framework includes joint monitoring committees with representatives from both nations, quarterly review processes, and graduated response protocols that prioritize diplomatic resolution while maintaining clear consequences for non-compliance. I could feel my confidence building as I moved through answers I'd rehearsed dozens of times with colleagues and industry representatives. The key is balancing accountability with mutual respect, ensuring that both nations benefit from adherence to agreed-upon protocols. A correspondent from Agricultural Radio asked about regional impacts, forcing me to discuss specific effects on farming communities across multiple states. This was where my background in agricultural economics proved invaluable, allowing me to speak knowledgeably about crop rotation patterns, seasonal employment, regional transportation networks, commodity storage capabilities. The framework includes specific provisions for smaller farming operations, recognizing that agricultural trade benefits should extend beyond large corporate producers to include family farms and regional cooperatives. I explained, thinking about the farmers I'd interviewed during my graduate research. We've structured quota allocations to ensure geographic distribution and operational diversity. For 45 minutes, I fielded questions that ranged from technical details about customs procedures to broader strategic questions about American competitiveness in international markets. Each answer drew on different aspects of my education and experience, weaving together economic theory, diplomatic protocol, industry knowledge, and policy analysis. When Secretary Williams stepped forward to conclude the press conference, I felt the satisfaction of having successfully represented complex policies to public audiences. But more than professional accomplishment, I felt the strange realization that my family had just witnessed my expertise displayed in front of national media for the first time in my career. Deputy Secretary Mitchell will be available for follow-up questions with agricultural and economic reporters, Secretary Williams announced as the formal session ended. Thank you all for your attention to this important announcement. The next hour involved smaller group discussions with specialized reporters, detailed explanations of technical provisions, background briefings about negotiation challenges and diplomatic considerations. By the time I finished the final interview, my phone was buzzing with messages from colleagues, industry representatives, and congressional staff requesting additional information or clarification. But the message that caught my attention was a text from Brandon. "Holy shit, Alex. We had no idea. You were incredible up there." I smiled despite myself remembering his dismissive comments about desk jobs and government bureaucracy. 48 hours ago, he'd been explaining why construction work was more impressive than policy analysis. Today, he was congratulating me for fielding questions from national reporters about billion-dollar trade agreements. Jessica had sent a longer message, watched the entire press conference with clients. They were amazed when I mentioned you were my brother. You made our family look incredibly accomplished. Thank you for representing us so well. Representing us. The phrase struck me as both generous and ironic, given that they'd spent 8 years treating my career as irrelevant to family identity. But I recognized the olive branch in her words, the attempt to claim pride in accomplishments they'd previously ignored. Even Patty had texted, "The television coverage was wonderful. You looked so professional and knowledgeable. I'm sorry we didn't understand before now." The apologies felt genuine, but they also highlighted how superficial their previous understanding had been. Television coverage and media attention had accomplished what 8 years of patient explanation couldn't, convincing my family that my work mattered. My phone rang as I was gathering my notes. Dad's number again. "Alex, we watched the entire thing. Every minute." His voice carried emotions I'd rarely heard from him. Pride, certainly, but also something that sounded like awe. The way you answered those questions, the way you explained those complicated policies, the way those reporters treated you with such respect. It's my job, Dad. This is what I do every day. But we never understood what that meant. When you said you worked in international trade, we thought you meant filing import forms or checking cargo manifests. We had no idea you were negotiating billion-dollar agreements with foreign governments. The confession hung between us. 8 years of miscommunication summarized in a few sentences. They'd never bothered to understand my work because they'd assumed government employment was inherently less important than private sector success. I'd never insisted on explaining it because their disinterest had seemed insurmountable. The work matters, I said simply. Trade policy affects real communities, real families, real economic opportunities. It's not abstract bureaucracy, it's practical problem solving that influences people's daily lives. We see that now. God, Alex, we see that now. I could hear voices in the background, family members apparently gathered around the phone wanting to contribute to the conversation. For the first time in years, they were actively interested in my professional life rather than politely tolerating it. There's something else, Dad continued. The local news called. They want to do a story about you, about having a deputy trade secretary from Denver. They want to interview the family, get our perspective on your career. Local news coverage, the ultimate validation in Dad's world, where recognition meant community acknowledgement and public credibility. For 8 years, my accomplishments had existed in Washington policy circles, invisible to the people whose opinions had shaped my understanding of success and failure. What did you tell them? That we'd be honored to talk about our son's accomplishments, if that's okay with you. The request surprised me with its deference. Dad was asking permission to claim pride in achievements he'd previously dismissed, acknowledging that his right to celebrate my success wasn't automatic after years of indifference. Of course it's okay, I said, just remember that trade policy is complicated. The sound bites that work for television don't always capture the nuances of international negotiation. We'll be careful, we'll be respectful. He paused. Alex, when you come home next time, could you help us understand your work better? Not just the big announcements, but the daily responsibilities, the challenges, the parts of the job that matter to you personally. The offer represented a fundamental shift in our relationship, from polite family maintenance to genuine curiosity about my professional identity. Dad was acknowledging not just my competence, but his own ignorance, and he was requesting education rather than assuming understanding. I'd like that, I said. There's a lot to explain, but I think you'd find it interesting once you understand how international economics affects local communities. We're ready to learn. Finally ready to learn. After ending the call, I sat in my office reviewing the day's events. The press conference had gone better than expected, generating positive coverage and stakeholder response. The trade framework would benefit American farmers and strengthen diplomatic relationships with China. My professional reputation had been enhanced through successful public representation of complex policies, but the personal satisfaction came from something simpler: my family finally understanding that their son had built something worthwhile in Washington. 8 years of patient competence had culminated in one evening's revelation that changed everything they thought they knew about my life and work. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken a Chinese ambassador's surprise visit to make my own family see me clearly. But perhaps that was appropriate for someone whose career involved building bridges between different worlds, translating between competing interests, finding common ground where others saw only division. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new opportunities to represent American interests in international forums. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, I felt like my two worlds were finally beginning to understand each other. 3 weeks after the press conference, I found myself back in Denver for what Dad had called a proper family dinner, not a birthday celebration, not a holiday obligation, just an opportunity for my family to engage with the reality of my professional life. The invitation had come with an unusual request. Could I bring some of my work materials? Maybe explain how international trade negotiations actually functioned in practical terms. The drive from the airport to the family home felt different this time. Instead of dreading polite small talk and subtle dismissals, I was genuinely curious about how our relationship might evolve now that the fundamental misunderstanding had been addressed. 3 weeks of phone calls had suggested genuine interest in learning about my work, but I'd experienced enough false starts with my family to remain cautiously optimistic. Dad met me at the door, and the first thing I noticed was how different his greeting felt. Not the polite "good to see you" of previous visits, but genuine enthusiasm. "Alex, come in. We've been looking forward to this all week." The house had been subtly rearranged since my last visit. The family room now featured a large table where the coffee table used to sit, surrounded by comfortable chairs positioned for conversation rather than television viewing. Someone had clearly thought about creating space for extended discussion, and I recognized Patty's organizational skills in the setup. "We wanted to create a proper workspace," Patty explained, noticing my attention to the new arrangement. "Somewhere we could spread out documents and really understand what you've been working on all these years." The effort was touching, even if it felt slightly artificial. For 8 years they'd shown no interest in understanding my work environment or professional responsibilities. Now they were literally rearranging furniture to accommodate learning about international trade policy. The motivation might have been guilt rather than genuine curiosity, but the gesture demonstrated commitment to making things different. Brandon appeared from the kitchen carrying a legal pad covered with handwritten questions. "I've been researching trade policy since the press conference," he said, slightly embarrassed. "There's so much I didn't understand about how international agreements actually work." I wrote down some questions. "If that's okay." I opened my briefcase and spread several documents across the table: policy briefs, negotiation timelines, economic impact assessments, correspondence with agricultural representatives. The same materials I reviewed daily in Washington, but foreign territory for a family whose business experience was limited to regional construction contracts. "Let's start with the basics," I said, pulling out a simplified diagram I'd prepared showing how agricultural trade agreements affected different stakeholders. International trade isn't just about moving products across borders. It's about creating frameworks that allow different economic systems to interact beneficially. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through the complexity of my daily responsibilities, not just the high-level negotiations that made headlines, but the detailed analysis, stakeholder consultation, regulatory coordination, and diplomatic relationship management that constituted most of my actual work. Brandon took notes like a student, asking clarifying questions about tariff structures and quota mechanisms. Jessica wanted to understand how trade policy affected small businesses and regional economies. Dad listened with the focused attention he'd previously reserved for construction blueprints and project specifications. When I explained how agricultural quota adjustments could affect employment rates in rural communities, he nodded with recognition of practical implications. "You're talking about real families, real livelihoods," he said. "This isn't abstract policy, it's economic survival for thousands of people." "Exactly," I replied, feeling the satisfaction of finally being understood. "Every provision in these agreements affects someone's ability to pay their mortgage, send their kids to college, maintain their family business. The responsibility is enormous." Patty had been relatively quiet during the technical discussion, but now she leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Alex, how do you handle the pressure? Making decisions that affect so many people, negotiating with foreign governments, representing American interests at such a high level." The question surprised me with its personal focus. For years, family conversations had centered on external accomplishments rather than internal experiences. Patty was asking about the emotional and psychological aspects of my work, acknowledging that high-level responsibility came with personal costs. "The pressure is significant," I admitted, "but it's also motivating. When you understand how policy decisions affect real communities, the stakes become personal. I'm not just negotiating trade quotas, I'm negotiating opportunities for American farmers to support their families. And you've been carrying this responsibility alone, Dad said quietly. For 8 years, dealing with this level of pressure without any support or understanding from us. The acknowledgement hung in the air, heavier than any apology. Dad was recognizing not just professional accomplishment, but personal resilience. For 8 years, I'd been building expertise and managing responsibility while feeling invisible to the people whose opinions mattered most to me. I had support from colleagues. I said diplomatically, the Department of Commerce has exceptional professionals. Director Crawford has been an incredible mentor. The work itself provided meaning even when family understanding was limited. Brandon set down his pen and looked directly at me. Alex, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect that I should have shown years ago. What you've accomplished, what you do every day, it's extraordinary. And I've been an ass about it. The bluntness was typical Brandon, but the sincerity was new. He was acknowledging not just ignorance, but active dismissal. The jokes about desk jobs, the comparisons to real work, the casual mockery of government service had all contributed to making me feel diminished in my own family. We all were, Jessica added. We measured success by local standards, by what we could see and touch and understand immediately. We didn't realize that your work was operating on a completely different scale. Different doesn't mean better, I said carefully. Construction work matters. Marketing campaigns matter. Local businesses employ people and serve communities. My work isn't more important, it's just different. No, Dad said firmly. Don't minimize what you've accomplished to make us feel better about our ignorance. Your work affects millions of people across multiple countries. You negotiate agreements worth billions of dollars. You represent American interests at the highest levels of international diplomacy. That's not just different, Alex, that's exceptional. The conversation continued through dinner, covering everything from my daily schedule in Washington, to my long-term career goals, to my perspective on American competitiveness in global markets. For the first time in 8 years, my family was genuinely engaged with my professional identity rather than politely tolerating it. After dinner, Dad suggested we move to his study for what he called a private conversation. The room had always been his sanctuary, filled with construction industry awards, family photographs, and memorabilia from his own career building the company from nothing. Now it felt like neutral territory, where we could address the personal aspects of our professional misunderstanding. Alex, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, Dad said, settling into his favorite chair. How much did our lack of understanding affect your career decisions? Did you avoid opportunities, turn down promotions, limit your ambitions because you felt unsupported at home? The question cut deeper than I'd expected. For 8 years, I'd told myself that family understanding wasn't necessary for professional success, that external validation was less important than personal satisfaction with meaningful work. But the truth was more complicated. I turned down several opportunities that would have required more public visibility, I admitted. Media interviews, congressional testimony, international conferences where I would have represented American trade policy in high-profile settings. Part of it was preference for behind-the-scenes work, but part of it was reluctance to explain my career to family members who fundamentally didn't understand or respect what I did. Dad's expression darkened. You limited your own advancement because of our ignorance. I made choices based on personal comfort levels, I corrected. But yes, family dynamics influenced some professional decisions. That ends now, he said with the same finality he'd used to close difficult business negotiations. From this point forward, you have our complete support for whatever direction your career takes. Public recognition, international assignments, cabinet-level positions, whatever opportunities arise. The declaration felt both generous and slightly overwhelming. For 8 years, I'd operated without family support, building independence and professional identity separate from their opinions. Now Dad was offering enthusiastic endorsement for ambitions I'd barely allowed myself to consider. There's something else, he continued, reaching into his desk drawer. The local news story about you generated more attention than we expected. 3 different business organizations want to invite you to speak at upcoming events: the Denver Chamber of Commerce, the Colorado Farm Bureau, the Regional Economic Development Council. He handed me a stack of formal invitations, each requesting my participation in panels or keynote presentations about international trade policy and its impact on local economies. The recognition felt surreal after years of invisibility, but it also represented opportunity to bridge the gap between my Washington expertise and my Colorado roots. I'd be honored to participate, I said, reviewing the event details. It might be valuable to discuss how international trade affects regional communities, especially in agricultural and manufacturing sectors. And we'll be there, Dad said. Not just as family, but as people genuinely interested in learning from your expertise. The promise represented a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic. Instead of me seeking their approval for my career choices, they were positioning themselves as students eager to learn from my professional knowledge. The reversal felt both satisfying and slightly uncomfortable, given how long I'd yearned for exactly this kind of recognition. My phone buzzed with a message from Helen Crawford. Alex, the Chinese trade delegation wants to schedule follow-up meetings next month. Ambassador Li specifically requested your participation. This could lead to expanded responsibilities in Asian trade policy. Are you interested? Expanded responsibilities. 6 months ago, I would have carefully considered how additional visibility might affect family relationships, how public recognition might create awkward conversations during visits home. Now, sitting in Dad's study with invitations to speak at local business events spread across his desk, those concerns seemed irrelevant. I need to respond to this, I said, showing Dad the message. It's about potential expansion of my role in Asian trade policy. He read the message carefully, then looked up with genuine excitement. This is incredible, Alex. They're recognizing your expertise and offering you greater responsibility. You have to say yes. It would mean more travel, more public appearances, probably more media attention. Good, he said emphatically. It's time people knew what my son has accomplished. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but it was different from the shock and awe of 3 weeks ago. This was informed pride, based on understanding rather than surprise, rooted in genuine appreciation for the complexity and importance of my work. I typed a response to Helen. Definitely interested. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss expanded role parameters. Dad watched me send the message with obvious satisfaction. 8 years ago, when you told me you were turning down the engineering job in Denver to pursue graduate school in Washington, I thought you were making a mistake. I thought you were choosing theory over reality, prestige over practicality. The admission didn't surprise me, but hearing it stated directly still stung slightly. Dad had questioned my judgment at every major career transition, from choosing graduate school over immediate employment, to accepting government positions over private sector opportunities. I was wrong, he continued. Not just wrong about your specific choices, but wrong about what constitutes meaningful work. I measured success by local visibility and immediate financial return. I didn't understand that some accomplishments operate on scales that can't be measured by regional standards. Your work matters too, Dad. Building the construction company, employing local workers, contributing to community development. Success isn't just about scale. No, but it is about impact, and your impact extends far beyond anything I've accomplished in 40 years of business. The conversation was interrupted by voices from the family room. Brandon and Jessica had apparently been joined by their spouses, and the discussion of international trade policy was continuing without us. I could hear Mike asking detailed questions about currency fluctuation effects, and Brandon's girlfriend wanting to understand how trade agreements influence job markets. They're really interested, Dad said, noticing my attention to the ongoing conversation, not just politely interested, genuinely engaged. Jessica spent the entire week reading about trade policy. Brandon bought 3 books about international economics. Patty has been watching financial news programs trying to understand global market dynamics. The effort represented a level of engagement I'd never expected from my family. For years, they'd shown minimal curiosity about my education, my career development, my professional responsibilities. Now they were actively educating themselves about international trade policy, not because they had to, but because they wanted to understand my world. It means a lot, I said simply. It should have happened years ago, Dad replied. But better late than never. We rejoined the family conversation, which had evolved into detailed discussion of how trade policy affected different industry sectors. Brandon was taking notes about manufacturing implications. Jessica was asking about service industry effects. Mike wanted to understand agricultural commodity pricing. For the first time in 8 years, I found myself explaining my work to an actively engaged audience, rather than politely disinterested relatives. The evening concluded with family members exchanging contact information for continued discussions about trade policy implications. Brandon wanted to understand how international agreements might affect construction industry supply chains. Jessica was interested in how trade policy influenced small business export opportunities. Even Patty expressed curiosity about diplomatic protocol and international relationship management. As I prepared to leave for my hotel, Dad walked me to the car with obvious reluctance to end the conversation. Alex, this can't be a one-time thing. We need regular opportunities to stay connected with your work, to understand what you're accomplishing, to support your career development. I'd like that, I said, meaning it completely. There's so much more to explain, so many aspects of international trade policy that affect local communities in ways people don't realize. Then we'll make time to learn. Regular visits, ongoing conversations, genuine engagement with your professional life. He paused at my car door. And Alex, when those expanded responsibilities come through, when you're representing American interests at even higher levels, we'll be your strongest supporters. The promise felt both generous and slightly overwhelming. For 8 years, I'd built professional identity independent of family opinion, learning to find validation through work itself rather than external recognition. Now they were offering enthusiastic support for ambitions I'd barely allowed myself to consider. Thank you, Dad. That means everything. No, he said, gripping my shoulder. Thank you for persisting with work that matters despite our failure to understand it. Thank you for building something extraordinary, even when the people who should have been your biggest supporters were too ignorant to see what you were accomplishing. The drive back to my hotel felt different from any previous departure from family visits. Instead of relief at escaping polite disinterest and subtle criticism, I felt genuine excitement about ongoing relationships with people who finally understood and appreciated my professional accomplishments. For the first time in 8 years, my two worlds were not just coexisting, but actively supporting each other. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Thanks for tonight, Alex. I finally understand why you chose the career you did. Looking forward to learning more. Jessica had sent a similar message. Incredibly proud to be your sister. Can't wait to see what you accomplish next. Even Patty had texted. Thank you for your patience with our learning process. You've built something amazing. 30 minutes. She's reviewing final talking points for this afternoon's announcement. The president, even after 6 months of expanded responsibilities, the reality of briefing the nation's chief executive still generated nervous energy. This was the culmination of everything I'd worked toward since that first graduate seminar on international economics at Georgetown, the opportunity to shape policy at the absolute highest level of American government. Is the Chinese delegation confirmed for the signing ceremony? I asked, reviewing my notes one final time. Ambassador Li Wei landed 2 hours ago. He specifically asked to meet with you before the formal proceedings. Helen smiled knowingly. He told the State Department Protocol Office that you were the only American negotiator he trusted to understand the nuances of what we're announcing today. The compliment carried weight beyond personal flattery. In diplomatic circles, trust was currency more valuable than any formal agreement. Ambassador Li's public endorsement represented years of relationship building, countless hours of negotiation, and demonstrated competence that transcended cultural and political differences. My phone buzzed with incoming messages from family members who'd been tracking my schedule obsessively since learning about today's announcement. Dad had sent a text at 6 that morning, entire family gathering at the house to watch. We've invited neighbors and business associates. Everyone wants to see you make history. Brandon had added, little brother becomes national figure, never thought I'd see the day. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Jessica's message was characteristically detailed, coordinated watch party at my office. 20 clients confirmed attendance. Your success is now part of our family brand. Thank you for making us look good. Even that last comment, which 6 months ago would have irritated me with its self-centered framing, now felt like genuine pride filtered through Jessica's marketing perspective. My family had transformed from dismissive skeptics to enthusiastic supporters, and while the journey had been complicated, the destination felt authentic. The walk to the Oval Office took me through corridors where American history had been shaped by generations of policymakers and political leaders. Each step felt weighted with significance, not just for my personal career trajectory, but for the millions of Americans whose economic futures would be affected by the agreements we were announcing today. The president's executive assistant greeted me with professional warmth. Deputy Secretary Mitchell, the president is expecting you. She's reviewing agricultural impact assessments from your department. Inside the Oval Office, President Williams sat behind the resolute desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, completely absorbed in the economic projections I'd submitted 3 days earlier. She looked up as I entered, removing her glasses and gesturing toward the seating area. Alex, sit. We need to talk about this afternoon's announcement and what it means for your future. The directness was typical of her leadership style, but the personal focus surprised me. Presidential briefings typically centered on policy details and political implications rather than individual career trajectories. Madam President, the final implementation framework is ready for your approval. All stakeholder consultations have been completed, and congressional leadership has been briefed on the economic projections. I've read everything you submitted, she said, settling into her chair with obvious satisfaction. The agricultural provisions alone will benefit farming communities in 23 states. The technology transfer protocols will protect American innovation while enabling productive collaboration with Chinese partners. The enforcement mechanisms balance accountability with diplomatic flexibility. She leaned forward, her expression shifting from professional assessment to personal evaluation. Alex, you've accomplished something remarkable. Not just successful negotiation of a complex trade agreement, but fundamental reimagining of how America engages with its most important economic partner. The praise felt both gratifying and overwhelming. For 8 years, I'd been building toward exactly this kind of recognition, working incrementally toward policy influence at the highest levels of government. Now the president herself was acknowledging my contribution to American economic diplomacy. The framework represents collaborative effort across multiple departments and agencies, I said, falling back on diplomatic deflection of personal credit. The State Department, Agriculture, Treasury, Commerce, all contributed essential expertise. Don't minimize your role, Alex. Leadership means accepting recognition when it's deserved. She picked up a folder from her desk. I'm nominating you for trade representative. Full cabinet position, Senate confirmation required, complete authority over American trade policy. The announcement hit me like physical impact. Trade representative was the highest-ranking trade position in the federal government, reporting directly to the president, coordinating all aspects of international commercial policy. At 32 years old, I would be the youngest person ever nominated for the role and certainly the first to come from a working-class background in Colorado. Madam President, I'm honored by your confidence, but the political implications of such a young nomination could be significant. Let me worry about political implications, she replied firmly. Your competence speaks for itself. The Chinese delegation specifically requested your continued involvement in future negotiations. Congressional representatives from agricultural states have praised your understanding of rural economic challenges. Industry leaders across multiple sectors respect your technical expertise and diplomatic skills. She stood and walked to the windows overlooking the rose garden, her posture suggesting this was more than routine political calculation. Alex, I need someone in that role who understands that trade policy isn't abstract economics. It's about real communities, real families, real opportunities for Americans to build better lives. Your background gives you perspective that most Washington insiders lack. The personal element surprised me. President Williams had built her political career on authentic connection with working Americans, but I hadn't expected that philosophy to influence cabinet-level appointments so directly. My family didn't understand what I did for a living until 6 months ago. I said, uncertain why I was sharing this detail with the president. They thought I filed paperwork in a government office. It took a Chinese ambassador showing up at my father's birthday party for them to realize I'd been negotiating billion-dollar trade agreements. She turned back with a knowing smile. My father was a union electrician in Ohio. When I got elected to Congress, he told his friends I was doing something with politics in Washington. He didn't understand what congressional committees did or how legislation got passed. He just knew his daughter worked in government. The parallel was unexpected but profound. We both navigated the gap between working-class backgrounds and high-level policy influence, both experienced the disconnect between professional accomplishment and family understanding. How did you bridge that gap? I asked. By showing him that policy decisions had real consequences for people like him. When I voted for infrastructure spending that created jobs in his community, when I supported trade policies that protected manufacturing employment, he started to understand that government work could be as meaningful as any private sector career. She returned to her desk, opening the nomination folder. Your family understands now, don't they? They're hosting a watch party this afternoon. Neighbors, business associates, people from their community. 6 months ago they couldn't have explained what I did for a living. Today they're telling anyone who'll listen about their son, the deputy trade secretary. Because you showed them that your work matters. Not through abstract policy discussions, but through tangible results that affect real communities. She slid the nomination papers across the desk. As trade representative, you'll have even greater opportunity to demonstrate how international economic policy impacts ordinary Americans. The weight of the opportunity pressed against years of careful career building, incremental advancement through demonstrated competence, rather than political connections or family influence. Trade representative was the culmination of everything I'd worked toward, but it also meant unprecedented public scrutiny and political pressure. What about the Senate confirmation process? I asked. My background doesn't match typical cabinet nominees. No Ivy League undergraduate degree, no family political connections, no private sector executive experience. Your background is exactly why you're the right choice. President Williams replied. Americans are tired of economic policy made by people who've never worried about mortgage payments or job security. You bring authentic understanding of how trade agreements affect working families. She stood extending her hand. The formal announcement is this afternoon alongside the trade framework signing. I expect you to accept the nomination with the same competence you've demonstrated throughout your career. The handshake felt like crossing a threshold from which there was no return. Deputy Trade Secretary operated largely behind the scenes, shaping policy through technical expertise and diplomatic relationship management. Trade Representative would thrust me into constant public visibility, congressional testimony, media scrutiny, political calculation at the highest levels. I accept, Madam President. Thank you for your confidence. Don't thank me yet, she said with a slight smile. Cabinet positions come with responsibilities that make your current job look simple. But I believe you're ready for this challenge. The afternoon signing ceremony took place in the East Room, with media coverage broadcasting to audiences across multiple countries. Ambassador Li Wei and I sat at the formal signing table, surrounded by government officials, industry representatives, congressional leaders, and diplomatic personnel from both nations. The ceremony's formality contrasted sharply with the countless informal negotiations that had produced the agreements we were now formalizing. President Williams made opening remarks emphasizing the mutual benefits of strengthened trade relationships and the careful balancing of economic opportunity with national security considerations. Her speech hit notes that resonated with multiple constituencies: agricultural communities grateful for market access, manufacturing sectors appreciating technology protections, diplomatic observers recognizing the strategic importance of productive Chinese-American relations. Then she shifted focus in a way that made my pulse quicken. The success of this trade framework reflects exceptional work by dedicated public servants who understand that economic policy affects real communities and real families. Today I'm pleased to announce my nomination of Deputy Trade Secretary Alex Mitchell to serve as United States Trade Representative. The room erupted in applause, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling notes. I felt Ambassador Li Wei's hand on my shoulder, his expression conveying both congratulations and satisfaction that his American counterpart was being elevated to higher responsibility. "Well deserved, my friend," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning of what you'll accomplish." The formal signing proceeded with ceremonial precision, each document representing months of negotiation and compromise. But my attention kept drifting to the significance of what had just been announced. In 8 hours, my nomination would be headline news across major publications. By tomorrow morning, my background would be analyzed by political commentators and congressional investigators. Within weeks, I'd be testifying before Senate committees about my qualifications and policy positions. The recognition I'd spent 8 years building through quiet competence was about to become unavoidably public. After the ceremony concluded, I found a quiet moment to check my phone. The family group chat was exploding with messages, everyone reacting simultaneously to the nomination announcement. Dad's message stood out: "Watched the entire ceremony. When the president said your name, I started crying. 75 years old, and I'm crying in front of the neighbors because I'm so proud of my son." Brandon had added, "Trade representative. Do you understand how insane that is? You're going to be in the president's cabinet." Jessica's response was characteristically analytical, already fielding calls from reporters wanting family perspective on your nomination. "I've prepared talking points emphasizing your work ethic and dedication to public service. Hope that's okay." Even Patty had contributed. The watch party turned into a celebration. "Your father is showing everyone the press conference footage. He's so proud he can barely speak." The outpouring felt both gratifying and slightly surreal. 6 months ago, these same people had relegated me to the overflow table at a birthday party, dismissing my career as irrelevant paperwork. Today they were celebrating my nomination to one of the highest-ranking positions in American government. Helen Crawford found me in the corridor outside the East Room, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal warmth. "Alex, the president's announcement caught everyone by surprise, but it makes perfect sense. You've earned this opportunity through exceptional work. The Senate confirmation process will be intense," I said, already thinking through political challenges and potential opposition. "You'll handle it the same way you've handled everything else, with competence, preparation, and authentic dedication to public service." She paused. "Your family must be thrilled. They're hosting a celebration in Denver. 6 months ago they didn't understand what I did for a living. Today they're telling reporters about my accomplishments." "Better late than never," Helen said diplomatically. "Family relationships are complicated, but recognition eventually arrives for people who do exceptional work." The evening concluded with a private reception for key stakeholders in the trade agreement. I spent hours in conversations with agricultural representatives, manufacturing leaders, congressional staff, diplomatic personnel from multiple countries. Each conversation reinforced the reality that my role was expanding from technical negotiator to public face of American trade policy. Ambassador Li Wei approached as the reception was winding down, his expression thoughtful. "Alex, I wanted to offer personal congratulations before returning to Beijing. Your nomination is well-deserved, and I look forward to continued collaboration in your new role." "Thank you, Ambassador. The framework we've built together represents the kind of productive relationship both our nations need." "Indeed." He paused, choosing his words carefully. 6 months ago, when I arrived at your father's birthday celebration, I sensed tension between your professional accomplishments and family recognition. I hope that situation has improved. The observation surprised me with its perceptiveness. Ambassador Li had picked up on family dynamics during a brief encounter at a country club, recognizing the disconnect between my public competence and private invisibility. The situation has transformed completely. I replied honestly. My family now understands what I've been building for 8 years. They've become my strongest supporters. Excellent. Strong family support is essential for leaders in high-pressure roles. You will need that foundation in the coming months. He extended his hand with formal finality. Until we meet again, Trade Representative Mitchell. The title still felt strange, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit yet. But I recognized the significance of Ambassador Li using it before the Senate had even scheduled confirmation hearings. In diplomatic circles, anticipated appointments were acknowledged as fait accompli once presidential nominations were announced. The flight back to my Georgetown apartment gave me time to process everything that had happened in 12 hours. Morning briefing about routine policy implementation had transformed into presidential nomination for cabinet-level position. I'd entered the executive office building as deputy trade secretary and emerged as nominee for trade representative pending Senate confirmation. My phone buzzed with a call from Dad as I was unlocking my apartment door. "Alex, I know it's late, but I had to talk to you before tomorrow's news cycle starts." "It's fine, Dad. I'm still processing everything myself. The reporters who came to the house, they asked about your background, your education, your career trajectory. I realized how little I actually knew about your journey from Colorado to cabinet nomination." His voice carried embarrassment mixed with determination. "I want to understand everything. Not just the highlights that make good stories, but the actual experiences that shaped you into the person the president chose for this position." The request represented continued evolution in our relationship. 6 months of improved communication had established foundation for genuine understanding, but Dad was acknowledging there were still gaps in his comprehension of my professional development. "It's a long story," I said, settling into my apartment's familiar comfort. "I have time. All the time you need." For the next 2 hours I walked Dad through my entire career trajectory. The graduate school decision that he'd questioned, the research assistantship that taught me policy analysis, the junior analyst position where I'd learned diplomatic protocol, the senior analyst promotion that came from successful negotiation support, the deputy trade secretary appointment that resulted from demonstrated expertise in agricultural economics. Each stage had involved choices and sacrifices, opportunities accepted and declined, relationships built and maintained. The path from Colorado farm kid to cabinet nominee hadn't been linear or predictable, but it had been purposeful, driven by genuine belief that international trade policy could improve people's lives. "You built all of this through sheer competence," Dad said when I finished the chronology. "No family connections, no political favors, just consistent demonstration of expertise and dedication." "I had mentors who believed in me," I corrected. "Helen Crawford took a chance on promoting someone without traditional credentials. Ambassador Li Wei trusted my judgment when more experienced negotiators were available. President Williams recognized potential that others might have dismissed. But you earned their trust through your work. That's what matters." He paused and I could hear emotion in his voice. "Alex, I'm sorry I didn't understand sooner. Sorry I measured your success by standards that didn't apply to what you were actually accomplishing. You understand now, Dad. That's what matters." "When do Senate confirmation hearings start?" "Probably 4 to 6 weeks. The Judiciary Committee will review my background, political opponents will search for any controversial decisions or statements, interest groups will lobby for or against confirmation based on their policy preferences." Sounds brutal. It's part of the process. Cabinet positions require Senate approval precisely because they carry such significant responsibility. The scrutiny is appropriate. Will we be allowed to attend the hearings? The question surprised me. In 8 years of government service, Dad had never expressed interest in observing my professional activities. Now he was asking about attending Senate confirmation hearings, volunteering to spend days in Washington watching congressional proceedings. "Family members typically attend," I said. It's not required, but it's common. Then we'll be there. All of us. Brandon's already looking at flights, Jessica's rearranging her schedule, Patty's planning the logistics. His voice carried determination I recognized from his business negotiations. We missed 8 years of supporting your career. We're not missing this. After ending the call, I stood at my apartment window looking out at the Georgetown neighborhood where I'd built my professional identity. The same streets I'd walked as a graduate student, the same buildings where I'd studied trade theory and international economics. The same coffee shops where I'd reviewed policy briefs and drafted negotiation strategies. 8 years of incremental progress had culminated in today's announcement, but more significantly, 8 years of family disconnect had transformed into genuine support and understanding. The journey from invisible disappointment to cabinet nominee had required not just professional competence but personal resilience in the face of dismissal from the people whose opinions mattered most. My phone buzzed with one final message from Dad: "Sleep well, son. Tomorrow the real work begins. But tonight just know that your family finally understands what you've built, and we couldn't be prouder." I thought about that country club dining room 6 months ago, sitting alone at the overflow table while my family celebrated without me. I remembered the shock on their faces when Ambassador Li Wei asked for the trade secretary, the dawning realization that their overlooked relative had been living a completely different professional life. Most of all, I remembered Dad's expression when he finally understood that his son had accomplished something extraordinary. The path forward would bring new challenges. Senate confirmation battles, media scrutiny, political pressure, unprecedented responsibility for shaping American trade policy. But I'd be navigating those challenges with something I hadn't possessed 6 months ago: complete integration of my professional and personal identities, family support for my career trajectory, and genuine understanding from the people whose recognition had always mattered most. Deputy Trade Secretary Alex Mitchell was becoming Trade Representative Mitchell, pending Senate confirmation. But more importantly, I was finally just Alex, the son who'd earned his father's respect, the professional who'd found his family's support, the negotiator who'd succeeded in his most important diplomatic mission by simply being himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.